The Gospel writer, Matthew, is probably the most rude of the four. And it's no more evident anywhere than in his birth narrative. Mark, of course, the Gospel of Mark, doesn't even have a birth narrative. And John has a brief, otherworldly narrative to begin his Gospel. It isn't really a birth narrative at all. But it does remind us that light has come into our world, and the darkness cannot snuff it out, no matter how hard it tries. And that's certainly a nice, hopeful touch for the holiday season. And Luke, wonderful Luke. Luke gives us an adoring mother gazing down at her newborn. Luke gives us shepherds and stables and animals and choirs of angels singing, "What a mighty day! Peace on earth, goodwill to all." That's probably why Luke is the gospel of choice during the Christmas season. If you want a basically warm and fuzzy story to go with your eggnog and soft holiday music, then Luke is your man. And then there's Matthew. Matthew doesn't seem to think twice about breaking into our Christmas reverie with the cold, hard facts of life. Before the ink is even dry on his short but hopeful birth narrative, Matthew is the only gospel writer who quickly moves us away from the manger onto his story of what is often called the flight to Egypt, or more painfully, the slaughter of the innocents. Just when we were reveling in a birth, Matthew thrusts us into the pangs of death. Just when we think that light is on the rise, darkness reasserts itself. Just when a blow for justice is struck, we feel the pushback of evil. I wish Matthew, like Luke, could just let us revel in the joy of the moment and linger a bit by the manger, just a while longer. But Matthew almost cruelly reminds us that that is not to be. Matthew, the realist, reminds us that despite the baby's birth, evil has not taken a vacation. Matthew, the realist, reminds us that though the light has come, the powers of darkness are in no mood to slip away quietly into the night. And even though I do think Matthew is rude for calling our attention to these realities so impolitely soon after the birth of the babe, I believe he's telling us the truth. Whether or not his account of this event of the slaughter of innocents is historically based, or is his attempt to fulfill prophecy, the answer we don't know. But I do believe that he's trying to tell us something important and something honest and something real about who this baby is and what this baby's life will come to mean for the world. If you believe that this baby came to take us out of this world so that we can live life with God in another world someday, then Matthew is not your gospel. But if you believe that this baby's birth was about the transformation of life right here, right now, here on earth, then Matthew has something to say to us, even though we may not like what it is. Matthew believes that this baby's birth has consequences. And Matthew's narrative suggests that those consequences begin now and not in some awaited for afterlife. Matthew's narrative suggests that the light brought by the child is threatening to those powers hiding in the dark places of self-preservation and hiding behind an ideology of might makes right. The light brought by the child of God is so threatening, in fact, to the powers that be, that King Herod decides on a malicious course of action. King Herod decides that all children in his empire under the age of 2 must be killed, just to be sure that this Jesus child doesn't get the chance to grow up and shed light on Herod's abuse of his people. So it's hard. It's hard to hear Matthew's narrative and be apathetic about the struggles that we face if we're going to be followers of this child who will turn business as usual upon its head. If we're to follow this child who became an immigrant, fleeing with his family to Egypt at a young age, then we must not be naive. We must take seriously our responsibility to strangers in our midst. We must take seriously the call to hospitality to those immigrants who live in our own neighborhoods. If we're to follow this child, this particular child who was exposed to horrific violence during infancy, then we must not be naive. We must take seriously the violence of our own culture, where children are killed in schools and on street corners. And semi-automatic weapons are in many cases as easy or easier to get than a driver's license. If we're to follow this child, this particular child who was born in humble circumstances, then we must not be naive. We must take seriously the plight of the poor in a society where the wealthiest of corporations are apparently making record profits, yet many of their employees are not paid a sustainable wage for themselves and for the children they so want to support. And the institutional church, it should be said, the institutional church itself is not immune to the abuse of power, as the current movie Philomena poignantly portrays. Greg and I saw it yesterday at the sunrise, and if you haven't seen it yet, it's worth it. It's a story about real life from Matthew's point of view. Matthew then would not be surprised, I think. Matthew would not be surprised that the darkness of abusive power is still with us. His was not a naive gospel. He was rude enough to call our attention to it early on in the narrative. But what he might be surprised at, he might be surprised at our apathy in the face of it. If Christ is the light of the world, then the followers of that light are called to bear witness to it, even when it is not convenient to do so. But how we give witness to the light is just as crucial as the fact that we do. We cannot use the tactics of the powers that be in order to usher in the light. We cannot use brute force to usher in the peaceable kingdom. We cannot resort to hating our enemies if we are to embody the love of God that is given to us in this child. God calls us to transform the powers of darkness with the non-violent, non-vengeful, non-abusive power of the love that this child has set loose in the world. In his beautiful children's story called Christmas Moccasins, Ray Buckley tells a poignant and moving tale through the eyes of a Native American child. A child who, like Jesus, had already experienced the abuse of violence in his young life. I wondered if the trees remembered us, remembered that months before we had walked this way. Did they recall that an old woman and a small child had been stopped by 3 drunken youths? Did the trees remember that those youths had hit us, that they had knocked us down, and laughing had taken our coats and our grandmother's moccasins? Would they know that my grandmother had walked home barefoot in the snow and that frostbite had taken 2 toes? The child remembers how his grandmother had tended to their physical wounds once they made it back home, and then had begun to tend their spiritual wounds as she prayed in the twilight of the kitchen. But she did more than pray. You see, she was a remarkable beater, and she began to make 3 pairs of moccasins, even beating the bottoms of the moccasins, something that was rarely seen. When Christmas Eve came, the grandmother called her grandson to put on his coat, and stepping out into the snowflakes, they began to walk. And here's where I'll pick up Buckley's story again. Pausing at the top of a low hill, grandmother prayed quietly. I could not control the pounding of my heart. Why are we here? I asked my grandmother. Why are we going to see them on Christmas Eve? Her shoulders and head were bent toward the snow. There was a long quiet before her words were heard. We're here to do the Creator's work, she said. We're here to do the Creator's work. It seemed that the walk from the top of the hill to the house below took forever. Snow reached my grandmother's knees and hurried past us as if it had a journey of its own. Our journey was much slower, as if heavy hearts kept our legs from moving. The door was opened by a large man. Behind him was a juniper tree covered in Christmas lights. I have small presents for your sons, my grandmother began. May I give them? She handed each a package, carefully wrapped. To each she said, I wanted to wish you a Merry Christmas. God bless you. The room was quiet. 3 pairs of moccasins lay in 3 sets of hands, covered in faceted beads in white and red and blue and yellow. They caught the light of the cabin, like the snow caught the light of the moon. There was no need for words. None was spoken. The moon shone down on an old woman with a limp and a little boy holding on to her coat. With shoulders back, we smiled at the snow, the trees, and the world around our feet. At the grove of trees, my grandmother paused to touch each one, as if to say, it's okay now. In the small house were captives of God's love. But we were truly free, liberated by that very same love. Friends, in short order, Matthew's rude, realistic gospel reminds us that though the light has come, the darkness has not taken flight. But Matthew's rude, realistic gospel also reminds us that in the birth of light and love in a manger, we have been given power to respond differently. We have been given power to respond differently. Like so many of those who've given us examples before, Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, we have been given the power to respond differently. The road before us will continue to be painful and steep. But as those liberated by that same love, we are here. We are here to do the Creator's work. We have been given the power to live differently and to live in ways that will transform this world forever. So with persistent humility, let us together be about the Creator's work. Merry Christmas. Amen.